The injury risk is real, but the Jets should play their starters in the preseason. Let's discuss why today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm John B. from GangGreenNation.com, and today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Join all the action at FanDuel.com to play daily dingers and make your free pick on who's hitting a homer this MLB season. On today's episode, we're going to discuss how the Jets should handle the preseason. In particular, we'll talk about why they need a plan with their substitution patterns. We'll also discuss why the Jets should give a lot of playing time to Cade Klubnik in their 3 exhibition games, and why they should play their starters in these games. The preseason kicks off Friday night as the Jets host the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at MetLife Stadium. It is a 3-game schedule in the preseason. That's how it's been since 2021. And I think if you're an observer of the NFL, it's kind of interesting to see that teams aren't all that creative about how they use these games. In fact, there's a lot of groupthink, and it's been that way practically forever. Prior to 2021, the preseason was 4 games because the regular season had 16 games. So traditionally what teams did was maybe give their starters a series or 2 in game 1, expanded a little bit in game 2. Game 3 was what was known as the quote-unquote dress rehearsal. That was the one exhibition game where you game planned like it was a regular season game. For the most part in preseason, you're running very vanilla schemes. You're not really that worried about matchups. You're not really trying to exploit opponent weaknesses. You're not trying to get your playmakers into premium spots the way you do in a regular season game. But in the past, the 3rd preseason game was the one point where you actually did that through the week because you were trying to simulate a regular season game. And the starters played into the 3rd quarter. The theory behind that was you wanted to create as authentic a regular season experience as you could in a preseason game. And the starters would have to go out, they'd have to warm up again for the second half, and they get maybe a series in the 3rd quarter. Then preseason game number 4, nobody who was prominent played. You usually benched your starters. If they played anything, they played maybe a series. Well, in 2021, the schedule expanded. The regular season became 17 games, and they reduced the preseason schedule from 4 games to 3. And through the years, since 2021, you've seen some trends take place in the NFL. And those trends are mostly limiting the number of snaps in the exhibition games that your starters get. There are some teams that don't even play their starters at all. And it makes me wonder what the point of these preseason games is. Because I think what happens in July and August should be about getting your team ready for the season. So if you're not going to play your starters, what's really the point of having these 3 games? In fact, the way teams approach it, I feel like they should reduce it to maybe 1 or 2 games because there's not much gained by just having a bunch of like borderline roster players get on the field for 60 minutes. And I think this speaks to an issue that's prevalent across the NFL. Teams kind of copy each other. They don't really think critically about how to best utilize things like preseason games, in addition to other stuff. These games are there to help your team prepare for the season. And one thing that's notable to me across the league, in week 1 of every single regular season, you see teams that just aren't ready to play, teams that aren't prepared for the season. You see results that just make no sense. You see like teams that end up terrible beating teams that are good. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way teams just aren't prepared for the season. And some of this, in fact, a lot of it probably has to do with coaches being scared. If you put your starters on the field during a preseason game and they get injured, you get criticized. But this mindset makes people forget what the point of these games are. You're trying to balance the risk between, trying to avoid getting your players hurt versus preparing them for the season. There's always risk when you set your foot on an NFL field, whether it's a practice field or a field for a game. We've seen it through the training camp for the Jets so far. They've suffered a lot of injuries in practice, and practices really aren't that intense. The latest injury came Saturday when 2nd overall pick David Bailey suffered an ankle injury. Fortunately, doesn't sound serious, doesn't sound like the sort of thing that's going to make him miss extended time. Rookie 7th round pick VJ Payne also suffered a bone bruise. That's a little bit of a different story. He's going to be out a couple of weeks. The only silver lining is that Payne was not expected to be a big player for the Jets this year unless they were kind of decimated by injury at the safety position. But I wonder why teams don't see the value in playing exhibition games. Week 1 every year, you see teams that are just exhausted in the 4th quarter of games. Now, every NFL player is in great condition physically, But there's a difference between being in great physical condition and football condition, where you're used to hitting for 3 hours. And I'm not saying like any team should play their starters an entire game, but I compare what teams do now in the preseason versus what they did as recently as like a decade ago. And it's very striking. And again, like I think some of it has to do with coaches being afraid of getting criticized. If you're a longtime listener of this podcast, you know that I was no friend to Adam Gase during his Jets tenure. You know that I hated the hire from day one. You can go back and listen to the podcast I did the night the Jets hired Gase. I was on with Brian Bassett of the Jets blog fame, and we both just couldn't believe that they hired Gase. I was critical of Gase through his entire 2-year tenure. The only thing I'll defend Gase on is his first year in 2019. He got criticized because a starting linebacker, Avery Williamson, was on the field after the rest of the starters in the first preseason game against the Atlanta Falcons. And he unfortunately suffered a season-ending injury. And Gase got criticized nonstop for that. That may have been the one criticism of Adam Gase I felt was illegitimate. Because, you know what, I don't think it's something that a coach should really get annihilated for if a player happens to get injured in a preseason game. Again, we've seen guys get injured on the practice field. The Jets a couple of years ago had their starting quarterback suffer a non-contact injury the fourth play on offense of the season when Aaron Rodgers suffered that Achilles injury. You know, stuff like that happens, unfortunately, and it can happen at any point. In 2021, the Jets had Carl Lawson, their premium free agent addition, a big-time pass rusher, or at least was supposed to be a big-time pass rusher, lost for the season with an Achilles injury in a joint practice with the Green Bay Packers, not during an exhibition game. So I understand that there's a risk of injury, but you have to balance that with getting your team ready for the season. And I think for the Jets this year, week 1 is particularly important because this is a team that is going to take the field not really knowing how good they are. You know, there's going to be hope. Every team has hope week 1. Hope springs eternal in the NFL, particularly in the early part of the season. But getting off to a good start this year, particularly in that first game, is important for the Jets because they follow it with 3 straight games against the NFC North. After Tennessee, they get Green Bay, they get Chicago, they get Detroit. 3 games that won't be easy. But if you beat Tennessee week 1, let's say you go 1-2 in those next 3 games against the NFC North. That's doable, isn't it? You get to Cleveland week 5, you beat them. Suddenly you're off to a 3-2 start. And you know what? You got a shot at least having a surprise season. That's if you win week 1, though. And it's critical. And while I understand the temptation to be conservative, I think there's something to be said for your guys having game reps, your guys being sharp. Because the way practices are held right now, particularly in training camp, is far less intense than it was in days past. Now, I think that players come in much better condition. I talked about this a bit last week. I don't know that training camp is as essential for getting players into good physical condition. But again, there's a difference between physical condition and football shape. I don't think training camp does a great job of getting players into football shape anymore because the hitting's been limited. And this goes back to some changes the league made in 2011. The owners ended up negotiating with the players, and the owners ended up getting more of the money. So in exchange for taking less money, the players got the owners to agree to reduce the practice schedules across the NFL. Now, lots of things in practice that used to be commonplace are outlawed. It's much easier to practice these days. I think that the Jets should look at this preseason, and I'm not saying like you play the starters all 60 minutes of all 3 games, but I think there's something to be said for taking a more aggressive approach by putting your starters on the field. I think that this is the sort of thing that could create a competitive advantage for the Jets or for any team that followed in the league. But it requires your coach to think outside the box a little. It requires your coach to have a little guts because you're going to be criticized if one of your players gets injured. People will always ask, why was he on the field during preseason? Again, you could get an injury week 1. You could get an injury first quarter of week 1. No one will criticize you. You could have an injury during training camp. No one will criticize you. But for whatever reason, if you get an injury during an exhibition game, you're the worst coach in the league. I don't think it's really fair, though. And I think, again, there's a balance to be had. You know, you don't want to run these guys into the ground during exhibition games, but you want them sharper. You want them to be functioning at a higher level. And this is like your one opportunity to get game reps before the season starts. So I think the Jets should have their starters play in the preseason. And I think they should play more than the series in each game. And I think that that's the sort of thing that could get the Jets on track in week 1. Another guy who should play a lot during the preseason is Cade Klubnik. In fact, I'm going to give you a bold take right now. I think that every preseason snap a quarterback should either go to Geno Smith or Cade Klubnik. I'll explain why continuing here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Baseball fans, if you think you know who's hitting a homer today, FanDuel is giving you a free chance to call your shot with daily dingers. It's easy to play. Just make your free pick for who you think will hit a home run in their game. If you're right, you'll receive a profit boost to use on your next bet for a chance at extra winnings. Best of all, you can make a free pick every day throughout the MLB season. Daily Dingers is another fun way to stay engaged with everyday's games, whether you're following your favorite team or keeping an eye on matchups across the league. Every game has someone capable of going deep. Now you get the chance to make your prediction before first pitch. There are just certain players where every at-bat feels like something big could happen. That's what makes Daily Dingers fun. You get to back the player you think is ready to go deep on that day. John Sterling, a famous New York announcer, once said you can't predict baseball, but you can predict who's going to hit a home run on FanDuel. So are you ready to play your game today? Join all the action at FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com to play Daily Dingers and make your free pick on who's hitting a homer. Play ball and swing for the fences on FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day, and for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. Big shout out to you everydayers. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. The preseason schedule kicks off Friday night for the New York Jets as they host the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Old friend Todd Bowles will be back in town. The Jets looking to get their preseason off to a good start. I mean, it doesn't really matter whether they win games or not. It's all about preparing for the season. And I don't think teams use preseason games to their full extent. I have to tell you, like 10 years ago, I questioned the utility of the exhibition season. You know what changed my mind? It was the pandemic year in 2020, when the entire preseason was canceled. Because of COVID, teams just held their training camps. They did not play each other in the preseason, and you saw so much sloppy football at the start of the year. And that made me think, you know what, maybe there's some utility there. I think there's also utility in using these games to develop young players, particularly young players who aren't going to be a prominent part of your team in the regular season, because this is their one chance to get reps at game speed. Going back to what I said in the first segment, practices these days, they're not as intense as they used to be. And that makes it tougher if you're a young player developing. There are good reasons that practices are less intense than they used to be, but it makes it more difficult to get the coaching staff's attention. In the old days, when you had two-a-days, you had a practice in the morning and a practice in the afternoon, and they were frequently going at like full speed, you were essentially hitting as hard as you would in a game, it was easier to make plays. It was easier to stand out. These days, you get one practice a day, and the contact is kind of limited. You don't get an opportunity. Really, the exhibition games are your one shot. And these games are like your one shot to develop players. And I don't really understand the way teams use their quarterbacks in these games. And I think it speaks broader to how these games are used. It's like everybody's got to participate. It's almost like one of those like games where like you want to get everyone in, like the All-Star game or something like that. Everyone's got to get a few snaps. And that's not really maximized in the way you use players, particularly at the quarterback position. I think the Jets should have every preseason snap go to either Cade Klubnik or Geno Smith. Geno should get the snaps he needs to get sharp, to develop chemistry with his wide receivers, to execute some basic concepts, basic staples within the playbook. Again, I think that stuff's important. I don't think we need to see Bailey Zappe, though. I don't think we need to see Brady cook. I think back 3 years. That was the year the Jets traded for Aaron Rodgers. And famously, they left Zach Wilson as their number 2 quarterback that year, which was a move that, I'll be honest with you, I questioned it at the time. But I questioned it for a little bit different reasons than most people. Now, I didn't think it was a great idea to leave yourself one play away from Zach going into the lineup. I felt like the Jets needed a higher level backup quarterback. I'll say this. I don't think there are many teams that are built to withstand your quarterback going down for the entire season 4 plays in. My issues were more if like Rodgers had suffered like a medium-term injury, like 2 to 3 games, maybe 4 games, someone who could kind of be a bridge to his return. That's the situation where I think a higher level backup could have made a difference for the Jets. I think that when Rodgers went down for the full season, it was always going to be a tough task. But part of the Rodgers trade, at least the way the Jets told it, was they thought like Zach Wilson taking a step back could maybe help him develop into the team's eventual long-term quarterback. Now, I was always dubious of this proposition because it was almost like they thought Rodgers was going to develop Zach. And I can't think of a single case where the veteran mentor quarterback was the difference between the young quarterback succeeding and failing. I think the veteran mentor has his place. There are situations where a veteran mentor has value. I think Rodgers did kind of help Zach with some of like learning how to run the team pre-snap, how to like figure out some defensive tells at the line of scrimmage. But it wasn't like Rodgers was going to turn Zach Wilson into a good quarterback on his own. That's just not how it works. That said, like if the Jets had a legitimate plan to have Zach take a step back, give him a chance to sit, at least I could have seen the logic. Putting Zach in as the number 2 guy, though, left high odds that he was eventually going to play. Now, I don't think any of us could have foreseen that he would end up starting most of the season because Rodgers got an injury so early, but there was always a chance he was going to go in the lineup. And that didn't make much sense to me. Because if you're trying to like revive Zach Wilson's career, well, you shouldn't have him play. You should just have him like working on the side. Because him playing means that he's going to be a lightning rod for the fan base. Whenever he struggles, the fans are going to jump all over him. And at that point in time, what Zach needed more than anything was to rebuild his confidence. So I felt like the most obvious move in the world was bring in a veteran backup for Rodgers and just like let Zach kind of be out of sight. Let him work on the practice field. Let him learn the reads. Let him learn passing concepts running the scout team. A big component of that, though, would be that my feeling of 2023 was Rodgers gets whatever work he needs in the preseason, and then Zach Wilson plays the rest of every game. Because again, that's like the one situation where Zach was going to be able to go at game speed. And it would have helped rebuild his confidence because even though Zach had a rough go of things during his first 2 years as a starter, a guy with 2 years of starting experience in a preseason game against vanilla defenses with practice squatters, third and fourth stringers, he's going to tear them up. And he was going to build confidence that way because he'd have success. And he'd be able to learn how to he'd be able to learn passing concepts, when to throw the ball, when to throw on time, in a very low pressure environment because nobody's going to jump on you if you struggle in a preseason game. And it was unlikely he was going to be able to do that. So I compare that with this year. A little bit of a different situation. You're not dealing with in Cade Klubnik with a guy who the fan base has turned on. In fact, the fan base is very excited about Cade. But what's the benefit of putting Bailey Zappe or Brady Cook on the field? I mean, Cook's shown he's really got nothing. There's not a ton of upside there. As far as Zappe goes, I think we know what we have in him. He's a guy who's maybe like a decent QB3. He's a guy who, if you put him in the lineup, he'll play like a decent game every month or so, but the rest will be struggles. Again, like Bailey Zappe's not going to develop. Brady Cook's not going to develop. Cade Klubnik could develop. And this is an opportunity to get him on the field. Again, favorable situations because he's going to be a 4th-round pick. And you leave him into like the 3rd, 4th quarter of these exhibition games. He'll be going up against UDFAs, guys he should handle pretty easily. A chance for him to go at game speed. And a real chance for the Jets to assess whether he's ready to handle the QB2 role. A little bit different from Zach. I think with Zach, given the dynamics in play in 2023, they should not have even considered making him the QB2. But this year, Klubnik's nominally in a competition for the backup quarterback job, but I feel like he's almost in a competition with himself. The other option is Bailey Zappe. And again, we know what Bailey Zappe is. We know we're not going to get like stellar play from Zappe. We know what his limitations are. And I don't think a couple of preseason snaps are really going to change anything with him at this point of his career. I'm not saying a player can't improve when he's as deep into his career as Zappe is, but what I'm saying is that it's very unlikely you're going to see leaps and bounds, the sort of improvement you would need for Zappe to feel good about Bailey Zappe as your number 2 quarterback. Whereas Klubnik would have an opportunity to get some NFL experience against real NFL defenses. I know like we're talking about the players he'll be up against. He'll be practice squatters, fringe practice squatters. That's not the worst thing in the world. It's still a higher level of opponent than he faced at Clemson. And I don't mean to disparage the ACC. I don't mean to disparage any conference in college football. But even the guys who are battling it out for practice squad spots in the NFL are leaps and bounds ahead of the competition you faced in college. Pretty much anybody who's in the NFL in any capacity was a star at his school, was one of the top players on his college team. You were essentially facing college all-star teams when you play in the 4th quarter of a preseason game in the NFL. And this goes back to something I've been discussing during this episode. Teams don't think this stuff through, and teams don't take full advantage of what these reps provide you. You get 3 games. You get 180 minutes in total. And how do you use them? Are you maximizing what's best for your team in the short run and in the long run? In the short run, I think there's real benefit for the Jets to get their starters out there, help them get sharp ahead of the Tennessee game in week 1. In the long run, well, there are only so many quarterback reps to go around, and the Geno reps have to take priority. Getting Geno Smith ready for week 1, that is critical. But any rep that doesn't go to Geno Smith, I think it's wasted if it doesn't go to Cade Klubnik because it's an opportunity for him to play in a real game. It's an opportunity for him to show what he can do. It's an opportunity for him to learn against NFL defenses playing at NFL speeds. So if it's up to me, Cade Klubnik's getting every rep that Geno Smith's not in there for. I think that's just logical for the Jets. I think that's the best use of those reps. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll dive deeper into the idea of maximizing these 3 preseason games. I think every substitution the Jets make in these games needs to be with a plan in mind. And I'll explain what I mean as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode is brought to you by Odoo. Running a business should not feel like you're trying to connect a bunch of systems that were never designed to work together. One app for accounting, another for inventory, another for sales, and somehow none of them talk to each other. That's where Odoo comes in. Odoo is an all-in-one business management software that brings every part of your business together in one powerful platform. From sales and accounting to inventory and marketing, everything works in one place, helping your team move faster, stay organized, and focus on growing the business instead of managing software. The best organizations know that success is not just about talent. It's about having everyone work towards the same goal. And that's true in sports just like it is in business. Take the Jets. They had 4 picks in the top 50 of the NFL draft, but they weren't just looking for the biggest names. They wanted guys who were going to work hard and buy into what Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji are building. These were not reactionary moves. The Jets had a vision, they stuck to it, and now you'll see the results because everyone was working from the same playbook. Great organizations win because operations matter. And that's why you should get Odoo. Try for free today at odoo.com/lockedon. That's odoo.com/lockedon. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Monday. We're talking about Jets preseason. The first exhibition game is this Friday night against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We're discussing how the Jets should use these games. My belief is that NFL teams do not maximize these 3 games. The reps you give are big opportunities to prepare your team for the season and develop talent. In our first segment, I laid out why, despite the risk of injury, the Jets should play their starters at least a little bit in the preseason. In our second segment, I talked about why the Jets should give most of their quarterback reps to Cade Klubnik. In fact, I believe that every quarterback snap in the 3 preseason games should either go to Geno Smith or to Cade Klubnik, because what are you really gaining from having Bailey Zappe or Brady Cook play in these exhibition games? Not a whole lot. You have Geno prepare for the season, you have Klubnik try and develop. Now let's talk about general substitution patterns. And this is something that drives me crazy because I think there are so many ways teams could use substitutions in preseason games to help prepare themselves for the regular season. And a lot of this is based on how you treat backups. Backups play a lot of snaps during these exhibition games, and that's fine. But I don't think we really simulate the regular season experience in these exhibition games. When a backup has to go in during a regular season game, it's kind of like a last minute thing. You usually do not get a lot of notice because you're going in immediately after an injury. You didn't have time to prepare. And I think that when you use substitutions, at least early in these exhibition games, you should try and simulate that. You should send a guy in when he's not expecting to go in. So an example of this would be maybe tell Cade Klubnik, you'll go in when the starters are done. You'll go in at this point of the second quarter and then send him in a little bit early. Because if he needs to play at some point during the regular season, he's not going to have a week to prepare for the game the way he does these exhibition games. He'll have to go in at a moment's notice, and he'll have to work with the first team. I think that there would be a real benefit to Cade Klubnik at least getting a few first-team reps. Now, Geno should get the majority of them. But send Klubnik in situations where he's not expecting to go in. Make it as realistic as possible. You have to simulate regular season games. The reps Klubnik gets in the second half of exhibition games will matter for him because going back to what we said in the second segment, these are opportunities to play at game speed, opportunities that don't exist in training camp, because in training camp for quarterbacks, you're wearing a red jersey, which means you can't be hit. And there's good reasons you don't hit the quarterback in practice. But it's mentally not the same as being in a game situation where there's a possibility you could be hit. It's just common sense that, as much as you try and simulate regular games in practice, when in the back of your head the other guy can't hit you, it's not the same thing as regular games. So give Klubnik second half reps, but also give him a few reps with the first team offense where he has to go in on a moment's notice and execute plays he wasn't preparing for all week. On the same note, I think there should be strategic moves like this where A backup goes in with the starters, just as he would in a regular season game without much notice. And the offensive line would be a good spot for that. Offensive lines, of course, depend on continuity. Of course, you want talented players. Of course, individual skill matters. But 5 individuals on an offensive line are only as good as how well they work together. You could have 5 great players, but if they don't communicate well, if they don't have chemistry, they will underperform. And 5 average players can turn into a pretty good line if they know how to work together. There's only so much that can be gained from a couple of exhibition snaps, but I don't think you necessarily want the first time a 5-man offensive line plays together to be in the middle of a regular season game without a week of practice to work together. But if you suffer an injury on the offensive line, that's what happens. So at some point during the preseason, if you put the first team in there for a series, throw in a backup offensive lineman. Now, don't do that when Geno's in there. You do it when Klubnik's in there, because you don't want your starting quarterback to play behind anything other than the best offensive line you could put on the field. But take an opportunity to give these guys a chance to work together in a game setting, in a game situation. It's different than working together in practice. Unfortunately, teams don't think these ways. They generally put their first team in and then they put their second team in all together. But your backup offensive line, unless you're like really, really bad with injury luck, is never going to play together. And if your second team offensive line has to play all together in a regular season game, it's probably going to be a rough situation anyway. I think a handful of snaps for like one backup with a reassembled line, a reconfigured line, can do you some benefits during the exhibition season. And I think this is just true across the roster. I think that you pick your spots during the exhibition season to send in a key backup just so he has experience working with everyone around him, but particularly at the positions where chemistry matters. And another example of this would be wide receiver. Isaiah Williams is apparently having a big training camp. He's been getting some buzz the last couple of days. Look, we know Isaiah Williams is not going to be a starter for this team. The 3 starting receivers are going to be Garrett Wilson, Omar Cooper, and Adonai Mitchell. But Isaiah Williams could be called on to step up at some point. The Jets may need him to step into a role because of an injury. And we know Williams is a fantastic return man. If Frank Reich knows what he's doing, he'll design some packages for Isaiah Williams to get the ball in space. I think he'll do the same for Kene Nwangwu. But there could be a situation where an injury forces Williams to go into the lineup. So put him in those situations. What I don't want to see is a guy like Isaiah Williams go play like the third quarter of an exhibition game, because what'll happen there is like he'll play great because he's an experienced veteran receiver and he's going up against rookie UDFA defensive backs who don't know what they're doing. And what usually happens in situations like this is the veteran plays really well. People get excited to talk about what great depth he is, how maybe he should be a starter, but in reality, he's at a huge advantage. That doesn't really help anybody prepare for the season. In fact, those reps should go to young players. Once you get like the backups in, I don't want to see anybody with beyond 2-3 years of experience playing. A guy like Isaiah Williams should go in and work with the first team a little bit. Again, you mostly want the number one offense working together, but pick your spots to put other guys in so that you, at least if like one of these guys is forced into duty, if there's an injury somewhere along the way that forces you to reconfigure things, they at least will have some experience working together. And I think that if you took one theme from this episode, it's that NFL teams don't really think through how to maximize these 3 exhibition games. No, look, at the end of the day, the results don't really matter. Nobody cares if the Jets win or lose. Quick pop quiz. What was the Jets' preseason record last year? I don't think you know the answer off the top of your head. If you do, then you are a fantastic Jets fan. I congratulate you. But most of us don't remember whether the Jets win or lose preseason games. They're only memorable really for injuries when you look back on it. If your team suffers a big injury, then it's bad. And I think that's one of the reasons that people get too conservative, teams get too conservative playing their top guys. But you also have to remember, like, these week 1 games are important, and you have to prepare your team for them. I don't think they do those very well. And at the end of the day, it just seems like teams copy each other because like it's kind of become conventional wisdom in the league that you kind of just waste these games. You just throw guys out there who maybe aren't going to make your team and they're playing the majority of these snaps. And there's no real point to playing these exhibition games if that's going to be your approach. You should think, how can we maximize these things? How can we prepare ourselves for week 1? How can we develop our guys? How can we use these as a real benefit, a chance to put our young guys who we are focused on, our priority development projects? How do we get them into these games and give them as many game reps as possible? Because in preseason, one of your focuses can be development. In a way, it can't during the regular season. Once the regular season starts, you got to try and win games. That can be the only focus, at least until your team falls out of the playoff race and you're playing out the string. Then maybe you can focus on getting young guys in there. So, but until that happens, this is your last chance to give full attention, give a real chance to develop to your young guys. And I think the Jets should take advantage of these opportunities. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give us a 5-star review. If you enjoy the show and are listening or watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets. Talk to you then.